Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Ari Sachs of Congregation Beth Mordechai coming to another edition of this week's online Parsha class. Before we begin looking at Parashat Korah, I wanted to share one quick story that when I was in college at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, I took a class on biblical criticism, on the way of looking at the text and trying to understand how there are various different stories within the text kind of overlaying upon each other. So for instance, that in the first two chapters of Genesis, that one chapter has one story of creation. And if you look at chapter 2, that story of creation is very different than that one. And I remember in that class feeling a sense of loss, that here I was being taught that the text as I understood it is not a perfect text. In fact, that it's a human text, that it was written or redacted by human beings and looks and acts in a way that reflects its human authorship. And in criticizing the text as a perfect document, it really showed how there are all these different stories attached to it. And there was no judgment based upon it. There was no judgment attached to it, positive, negative, or whatnot. But I remember feeling that loss because the text that I loved seemingly was gone. And it leads to a question that if you are critical of something, does that criticism mean that you love it? You know, we often do that when it comes to our family, that we think we are critical of that person because we hope that they're going to get better. We point out the flaws. And yet for anyone who's received that criticism, we can know that pointing out the flaws can be a very painful experience. And we wonder if that person who's critiquing us is actually loving us. And as such, that question of whether or not critiquing is a sign of love is actually embedded within the concept of Torah. That for someone who loves the text, their job is to see that the text is perfect, that the text can speak to them in all different kinds of ways. But if you're just simply criticizing the text, you don't think about that kind of love, and you're simply looking at how the text can be understood. And I think that that question of how the text can be understood, whether it's simply in trying to understand it in the most perfect way, or in understanding it in a way that proves how it was created, leaves us with a sense of wondering about how it is that we should approach the study of Torah. And that kind of question really appears in this week's Torah portion of Parashat Korah. The beginning of the Torah portion, which isn't the second third, which is our main topic for today, speaks to how there are two different characters, you could say. One character is Korah. The other character or characters are Datan and Aviram. Korah says that he does not understand why Moses took leadership for himself and for his brother, and he rebels against that. Datan and Aviram are saying, Moses, how were you able to lead us? How have you not yet led us to the land of Israel? And so there are two different complaints, but the way that it's situated within the first chapter of the story, chapter 15 of Numbers, it seems that they were kind of came together, that they were the same rebellion, just different people with different gripes against Moses coming and sharing their challenges, their problems. But when we get to chapter 16, and we try to understand how, I should say, actually, this all began in the beginning of chapter 16. But when you get to the latter points of chapter 16, at the beginning of the second third of the Torah portion, you start to see how the differences between the two stories, which was hinted at the beginning by the fact that they had different qualms with Moses. One, Korach's, which is that you took this leadership and you didn't belong to you. And the other by Datan and Aviram, that you haven't fulfilled your role of leadership and taken us to the land of Israel. We can see how these two different approaches seemingly actually imply two different rebellions. And for that, we're going to begin the learning of this week's text, opening up Sefaria.org. I'm going to read in the English until we get to the important parts in the Hebrew. And they fell upon their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be wroth with the whole congregation? And God said to Moses, saying, Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get you up from about the dwelling of Korach, Datan, and Aviram. He'alu misaviv lemishkan Korach, Datan, va'Aviram. This phrase is important because it's seemingly bringing together these three characters, Korach, Datan, Aviram, into this singular story of rebellion. And Moses rose up and went unto Datan, Aviram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spoke unto the congregation, saying, Depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be swept away in all their sins. So they got them up from the dwelling of Korach, Datan, Aviram on every side. And Datan, Aviram came out and stood at the door of their tents with their wives and their sons and their little ones. So here we seem again to be referring to this singular tent, which includes Datan, Aviram, and Korach. And now Datan, Aviram specifically are coming out to stand at the front of the tent. We don't know where Korach is right now. Moses said, Hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and they have not done them of my own mind. If these men die the common death of all men, and be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. Meaning that if I'm what I'm about to do and nothing happens, then you'll know that God hasn't actually sent me. Because I'm going to do a miracle, I'm going to invoke God, and then you're going to really see that God is here. But if the Lord make a new thing, and the ground open her mouth and swallow them up with all that ascertain unto them, and they go down alive into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have despised the Lord. And it came to pass, as he made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground did cleave asunder that was under them. And so here you have that the earth actually took in or destroyed all of the people that were seemingly with Korach, Datan, and Aviram. So it's seemingly this one story of rebellion. But now, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up in their households, and all the men that appertain unto Korach and all their goods. So they and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the assembly. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them, for they said, Lest the earth swallow us up. And now, here is the most important verse. And fire came forth from the Lord and devoured the 250 men that offered the incense. Now, this last line is extremely critical because there's something that doesn't seem to be clear. Who are these 250 men that have been devoured by fire by coming to the tabernacle? Weren't those 250 men with Datan and Aviram, with Korach, and weren't they all consumed in that flame? It doesn't seem to make sense. Not consumed the flame, that they were devoured by the pit. How could it be that one group is first devoured by the pit and then another group is seemingly consumed by the fire? It doesn't make sense at all. In fact, if we look back at that previous verse regarding Datan and Aviram coming out to the tent, it does not say that Korach actually came out from that particular tent. And it seems then that we actually have another proof text that maybe Korach wasn't involved in the coming out of the tent and being swallowed up. Because if we take a look at chapter 26, verse 10, we have a very interesting verse that kind of speaks to this challenge about finding out, first off, who these other men are, and second, where Korach fits in here. Vatiftach haaretz et piha, vativla otam, and then the earth opened up and swallowed them. Ve'et Korach, and with Korach, and with the Bemota Eda, and with the rest of the assembled men, referring Ba'achol ha'esh, et chamishim umatayim ish v'yiyu lenes. And regarding Korach and the entire Eda, the entire assembly, that they were swallowed up by the fire, eaten up by the fire. And the 250 men who were swallowed up by the flame, this became a sign. And so here we have a really fascinating line that one, that there is this actual being swallowed up by the ground, and also specifically that Korach and these assembled men were actually taken up by a flame, which seemingly appeared afterwards. And so you have here these two really different, seemingly different accounts of what is actually happening. One that is being swallowed up and one that is being consumed by fire. So how do we understand that? First, I want to go to a biblical critic. His name is Donald James Taylor, who explains some of the differences between these two different accounts and how you can understand them as referring to two different stories of rebellion. Numbers 16, 12 to 14, the narrator indirectly reports the complaint of Datan and Aviram expressed as dialogue. Their complaint is different from Korah, who seems to be motivated to supplant the high priest, which is what we discussed in the beginning, that they seemingly have different reasons why they're coming at Moses. Their grievance is directed to Moses' failure to deliver the nation into the promised land, and they are repelled by his authoritative leadership. Their complaint is obviously misdirected. The readership is perplexed by their complaint, as it was because of the people's unbelief, grumbling, and rebellion that has prevented them from proceeding directly to their destination. I.e., when we look at this text, it doesn't seem that Datan and Aviram have much to stand on because it's really the people's fault that they're not getting to their destination. Though their complaint is distinctly different, the acerbity of their rebellion should not be subordinated to Korach's. Meaning that it seems that even though that there is a difference in scope of in purpose of the rebellion, that it's the same level of acrimony directed towards Moses, and therefore we could assume that maybe this is the same rebellion. But the Aviram of the tribe of Reuben are almost as prominent as Korach. In chapter 16 and 26, they are mentioned with him. And in Deuteronomy 11:6 and Psalms 106:17, they are mentioned without him. So now I want to share the verse from Deuteronomy. Va'asher asa leDatan v'Aviram b'nei Eliab ben Reuven, and what he did unto Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuven, asher patzta ha'aretz et piha, how the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up. Vativlaem. Ve'batehem ve'toholehem ve'et kol hayekum asher b'raglehem bekerev kol Yisrael, and their tents and every living substance that followed them in the midst of all of Israel. So that here we have the fact that it was not just the fact that Datan and Aviram were with Korach, but that here in chapter 11, verse 6 of Deuteronomy, we have just Datan and Aviram as being swallowed up, which seems to be from our text. And so because of the fact that you have Korach with a different kind of rebellion than Datan and Aviram, and because you had this weird insertion of the 250 men who were being swallowed up by the flame, and then a couple chapters later on, it speaks about how Korach is involved with those 250 men who are also swallowed up by the flame, that it seems you have these two different stories of rebellion. Two different traditions of what the rebellion against Moses was, that are seemingly put together here in our chapter. Now, if you understand that to be two different stories of rebellion, then, and you have this kind of conflagration or this movement of kind of trying to put them together, but they don't really fit, that when you break them apart, you understand them, but then you say, our text is mistaken, our text is wrong in regards to the fact of trying to make it one, because it was actually two. And I don't know about you, but when thinking about whether or not the text that we have in front of us is wrong or right, it makes me feel, if it's wrong, that it is a human creation and thus not a godly creation. And that is where the importance of criticism comes in to an understanding of the love of the text, because if we look at that criticism just as criticism, we may leave feeling that the text no longer belongs to God and is therefore no longer holy for us. Simply another text to understand, to put together, and depending upon how we feel, whether or not it's important to us. But the rabbis say no. Particularly Abraham ibn Ezra, who was a 12th century sage from from Spain and France. And in fact, he was someone who not only looked at the text as something that is so holy, so special to try to understand as best as possible, but that he was someone who believed in the value of science, someone who believed in the value of trying to understand the truth of the matter because it leads us closer to God. He wrote many, many books on astrology and in mathematics, and someone who was really involved in those kinds of disciplines. And he has a very interesting take on this particular text, on the bringing together the two different stories of the Datan, Aviram, and Korah, that I think shows us how we can leave with loving the text. And for the sake of clarity and also to speed it up a little bit, I'm just going to read from the English translation of Ibn Ezra. This is a personal translation of the text of Ibn Ezra, which is based off of chapter 16, verse 35. There are those who say Korah was one of the ones swallowed up. Based upon the proof text, the earth swallowed them up with Korah. That speaks, by the way, to Numbers chapter 26, verse 10, where it says, Vativla otam ve'et Korah, and they swallowed them up together with Korah, right? And that would seem to refer to the fact that Korah died in that very first swallowing up along with Datan and Aviram. And there are those who say that he was burned, as it says in the same verse, and Korah with the band were consumed by fire, which again speaks to, in that Numbers chapter 26, verse 10, you have the swallowing up, and then also of the fire, b'mota aida ba'achol ha'esh. And that, so therefore you have this perfect kind of trying to bring together these two different stories. And our sages said he was burned and then swallowed. And this is sort of what the rabbis try to do. They take these challenges in our text and they try to bring them all together by saying, in this case, that first Korah was burned and then swallowed, even though that the text was indicating that first they were swallowed up and then they were burned, which doesn't seem to actually make much sense. Meaning, how could you be swallowed up and then burned? First you have to be burned and then swallowed. But now what Ibn Ezra says, and in my view, the earth was not only opened by the camp of Datan and Aviram, because it is not mentioned. Meaning that even though the text does not say that the earth was actually opened up in a different spot, it is possible that it actually was. And Korah stood with his fire pan with Aaron and the princes in the congregation by incense. So I want to back up just for a brief moment, try to explain what's happening here. You have here a story in which Datan and Aviram were swallowed up by the earth, and then Korah and the 250 men were burned. But if you just follow according to that logic, it's impossible for Korah to also be swallowed up, because being swallowed up appeared before being burned. And it's impossible to be swallowed up and then to be burned. You have to be burned and then swallowed up. And what Ibn Ezra is pointing out is that it is possible that even though the text does not say that the 250 men were burned, were swallowed up, that they actually were, after Datan and Aviram were swallowed up. Just to get back into the text. And the explanation in Numbers 26:10 that Korah is not connected to the ones who were swallowed up, but rather connected to with the band who were consumed by fire. And if you would argue and say, why does it not mention that Korah was with the ones who were burned? The answer, that after the text mentioned that the band was burned when they came to the priests. What this is saying here just to kind of want to take a moment just to try to understand it myself, is that what Ibn Ezra is pointing out here is an incongruency within our text. That within the context of this actual rebellion, of this actual being swallowed up, we don't know where Korah is. Korah is not mentioned with Datan and Aviram. Korah is not mentioned with the 250 who were engulfed in the flames. And so there is this question about how Korah specifically was killed. And what he is saying is that if you look at the text, if you look at the text in chapter 26, which we're going to look at right now, it seems that it's possible he is both being swallowed up and being burned. But if you look at the trup marks in the Hebrew, the Korah with this tipcha on the bottom here is connected to b'mot ha'eda. It is not connected to vativla otam, which means to be swallowed up. So that he is not connected with this first part of the verse. He's connected with the second part of the verse, is the argument. And that after that, even though the text has not mentioned it, that they were also swallowed up. And Ibn Ezra goes on to prove that even though Korah is not mentioned within our text in chapter 16, that because he is his band is mentioned, that he is included within it. And so what Ibn Ezra is trying to do is to align both of these texts together. You can argue whether he does a good job of it or not, but in saying that there is this aspect of being swallowed up and of the fire consuming the individual, consuming the band, that it seemingly are two different stories, but actually is one story in which there are multiple things happening, in which there are multiple kind of incidents. First, the swallowing up of Datan Aviram, and then the flame consuming Korah and his men, and then also, because we have a little bit before and we have a little bit afterwards, we have the actual consuming of Korah and Datan and Aviram, of Korah and his followers. And the value of this, apologize for the note, hold on a second. And the value of this is to say that what Ibn Ezra is trying to do is he's saying, yes, there is this issue in the text, but he's playing around with multiple verses, dividing it very very carefully to say one belongs here, one belongs there, in order to prove the point that the text makes sense. And that endeavor of trying to understand that the text makes sense comes out of this deep love of wanting the text to be not just meaningful, but to be whole. That it's something that we can hold on to and say that this is ours, this belongs to God, this also belongs to us. Our job is to try to understand it all of its variety of different ways. But when we break down the text, our job is to put it back together again in a way that leaves it meaningful for us. With that, I hope you enjoyed today's class. Take care and talk to you again soon. Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.